Good morning and welcome to the Japan Society's weekly webinar on the repercussions of the pandemic. I am Bill Emmott and I have the honor of chairing the Japan Society. I want especially to thank all of our members, individual and corporate, for your support of the Society in these difficult times, and all of you who have proved such loyal and regular attendees of these webinars. This week, our subject is China. These days, of course, China is always at the center of any discussion of geopolitics, of the global economy, or of business, but it has become even more so during the pandemic. At first, it was central because it was the first country to suffer the effects of the virus, and because a public backlash against mismanagement and lack of transparency promised potentially to weaken the position of President Xi Jinping, or at least so many commentators speculated. Now it is central for many other reasons. First, because it has been the first large economy to reopen and so can be seen as a test case for the future, but also because its role as a manufacturer and supplier of personal protective equipment and of other medical supplies has raised questions of quality, of reliability, and on the other hand, generosity. Because, as the origin of the virus, governments from Australia to America have chosen to point the finger of blame at China and to call for investigations of what happened in Wuhan. We saw that at the meetings of the World Health Organization this very week. And because, also only in the past week, the United States has targeted new sanctions on Huawei Telecoms company and on foreign firms that supply it with components, causing a dilemma for firms and governments in the UK, in Japan, and elsewhere. And because inside the Conservative Party in Britain, a lobby group, the Conservative Party China Research Group, has emerged, which is pushing for more hardline policies, including commercial ones, on China. Because if debt forgiveness becomes an important part of the international agenda in coming months and years, in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, many of those sovereign debts are owed to China via the Belt and Road Infrastructure Initiative. So Chinese policy will become especially important. Because if the pandemic causes companies to rethink their global supply chains, this generally means rethinking China. And finally, because if there is a big geopolitical question surrounding the consequences of this pandemic, it's going to concern whether or not this crisis may act to accelerate the rise of China towards a greater leadership role, perhaps in the absence of what is normally expected, namely American leadership. There are so many becauses, and that is why I'm delighted to welcome as our speakers today two great scholars of China. In the UK, I welcome Kerry Brown, Professor of China Studies and Director of the Lau China Institute at King's College London. Before entering the groves of academe, Kerry served as a British diplomat in London and Beijing. Moreover, I can reveal that he has a new book coming out in July for Polity Press called simply China. And in Japan, I welcome Akio Takahara, Professor of Contemporary Chinese Politics and Diplomacy at the Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Tokyo. Akio, too, has spent time in embassies, in his case as visiting scholar at the Consulate General in Hong Kong and the Japanese Embassy in Beijing. I don't know whether he has a new book coming out, but I do know he is rated as Japan's leading scholar today on Chinese politics and regional security issues. As usual, I will ask each of our speakers to open with 10 minutes of remarks, after which we will move to Q&A. You can submit questions at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So I will begin with Akio Takahara in Tokyo. Over to you, Akio.
Thank you very much, Bill, for your kind introduction. And it's a great pleasure and honor to be able to take part in this webinar with the Japan Society of the United Kingdom. Now, I would like to make 3 points in my initial remarks. I'll try to be short. The first question is the international situation that Xi Jinping is facing today. What kind of a situation is he facing? We all know that COVID-19 has brought about a serious blow to the image of China, and Xi Jinping is much aware of this, and he does, I think, fear danger of isolation, as it were. You know, all over the world, people, of course, understand that China, or Wuhan in particular, is ground zero. It's the origin of the pandemic. Although, despite the debate that's going on between China and the US, and the world knows that initially there was a cover-up, and there are still lingering doubts about transparency, and China is exerting pressure on the World Health Organization. And also, there has been some trouble with African countries, between China and some African countries, over the treatment of Africans who are living in China. Especially, there's a concentration in a city called Guangzhou, or Koshu in Japanese, in the Guangdong, the Canton Shore, the Guangdong province. So therefore, Xi Jinping has been trying to make some special diplomatic efforts to make up. He has been sending masks and protection gear, even doctors and nurses, to countries around the world that are suffering from the virus. And these efforts have been welcomed in general, no doubt about that. But in some countries, it has backfired. They've overdone it, as it were. Such as the unabashed requests from the Chinese diplomats for an open expression of praise and gratitude to China and to Xi Jinping in particular. So that's the general international scene that Xi Jinping is facing today. What about the domestic situation? There has been an uphill battle, I would say, against the economic downturn that's unprecedented in the past 30 years. According to the Chinese government, the GDP growth rate in the first 3 months, January to March, was minus 6.8%. This is the first time they have reported a minus for many, many years. And also, Xi Jinping is facing an uphill battle against further instability in society. You know, almost every day there are reports about workers' protests against wage arrears and so on and so forth, not only by workers in factories and shops, but also football players of several teams in the professional leagues. They are protesting against wage arrears, which actually started happening not this year, but last year. Already by late last year, Chinese economic downturn has become a very serious issue. And now, because of the coronavirus, it's in a very serious situation. What about the political situation? People are sharply aware of the faults in the political system, especially the death of this whistleblower doctor by the name of Li Wenliang sent a very big shock to a lot of the Chinese people. And one of the interviews that this doctor gave just before he died, he said in those interviews, he said that in a healthy society, there should not be just one voice. So people were very shocked by the death of this early whistleblower. But at the same time, a lot of people understand the strength of the system, the power that lies in the Chinese Communist Party. But overall, Xi Jinping, I think, understands the risks that he is facing, and therefore, well, he has launched a very powerful, forceful propaganda drive. You know, if I compare this to boxing, in the first round, the administration lost because of its slow move, because of its cover-up, because of the death of these whistleblowers. And Xi Jinping understood that. And therefore, in the second round, as it were, he tried very hard. One is to contain the virus, the contagion, and second, to recover the economy. And now we are entering the third round. The second round, Xi Jinping, I think he believes that he has won. So in this third round that Xi Jinping is facing today, he has to recover the economy and he has to keep on controlling the virus. It's not a very easy task to do, but that's the situation he's facing. And the third issue that I would like to touch upon is how we should deal with China in this kind of a situation. And the basic point I think we should understand is that China is not monolithic. Views are divided there. What I mean is that on the one hand, if I make a rough categorization of the different ways people think, on the one side, there are hardliners who tend to be nationalistic, who are nationalists and who are conservatives. And on the other hand, there are the moderates who are the internationalists and who are the reformers. And on this basis, I would say that excessive pressure is unwise because it's going to marginalize the moderates, marginalize the internationalists and the reformers. So we need to learn the knack of competing with China. You know, competition is real, especially in the realm of security. But also we need to learn how to cooperate with China at the same time. So on the one side, we should criticize China's hardline words and deeds. And on the other hand, cooperate pragmatically where we can and where we need to do so. Supply chain reforms that have been proposed by the Japanese government, using money, budgets to help the companies who would like to shift the supply chains out of China. That's a pragmatic response to reality. You know, you should not put all your eggs in one basket. And if there are companies who would like to pull out of China, the government is going to help, especially those who are coming back to Japan. But this doesn't mean that the Japanese business is going to leave China altogether. Of course not. There are a lot of companies who would like to go in to China. And I think that's the case not only with the Japanese enterprises, but Europeans and the North Americans also. The first phase of the agreement that the Trump administration signed with the Xi Jinping administration indicates that that's not a policy of decoupling, but rather it's a policy to open up the Chinese economy further to the American enterprises. So we should try and see very clearly which part is black, which part is white, but the overall picture is a gray one. We have to learn how to live through this contradiction that we are facing with China. That's all I have to say as my first remarks. Thank you very much.
Splendid. Thank you very, very much, Akio. I welcome those opening comments, and in particular, I very much like the boxing match metaphor. Perhaps this is a permanent boxing match, one of many rounds, but one in which there is never going to be any single knockout blow. I like the thought of Xi Jinping in a boxing match. But you can see, as an old editor, I'm looking at a caricature for my cover, you see, of the boxing. Now I'm going to hand over to Kerry Brown, who I shall not describe as a pugilist.
Well, you can probably remember, Bill, in the 1970s, there was always British professional wrestling on TV, and the outcome was always known beforehand, remember? You always knew who was going to win beforehand. So I suppose my questions will really be about, the sort of major geopolitical changes that we've seen happening through this event. I think it's intensified things that I think were already there. The conflict between the United States and China is well known. The desire to decouple and the frustration, it not being easy to decouple. And it's also reinforced the idea there's certain areas, public health issues, for instance, and environment, where you can decouple, at your, as you can want to decouple, but it's just not going to happen. So the pragmatism versus the sort of, the instincts to kind of not cooperate and work with China because of political differences. I did say sort of introduction and reflecting about the kind of very political nature of China now. I feel even in my work, and I'm sure Professor Takahara might, that things I said 3 or 4 years ago just describing China suddenly now, it's like I'm sort of trying to defend China, and I'm just doing the same thing, just describing and trying to understand what I see. But it's become a very politicized issue in the UK, and had been a very politicized issue with a different sort of intensity in the United States. I think if you interrogate that, that's because in the last sort of, I think in modern times, but really in the last 40 years, the dominant mindset has been to save or damn China. You either, get people who want to save it, through engagement, to make it kind of politically reformed because that will be good for it, in America and Europe in particular, or you get people that feel that this is, a kind of great kind of criminal in some ways, that China persisting with this political system is sort of, kind of bad, that China has, kind of a sort of existential badness about it. And I guess now what we see is this weird situation where on an issue like this, it's pretty clear that China can save or damn us. I mean, and I guess this is sort of, kind of, which creates us, I think, a diplomatic feeling of discomfort that people, I feel, in commenting about China, and particularly in Britain. You mentioned, I think Bill mentioned the Conservative Research Group. So whenever a politician uses the word research, you get very uncomfortable. This is going to be driving to predetermined conclusions. But I mean, it seems to me that the whole driving narrative of that is, again, this idea of, we as Europeans or Americans are saving and damning China, and not really understanding that, in fact, all this recognizes, the whole COVID-19 thing has made clear, is that China economically is a fifth of global GDP, China as a fifth of humanity, China as this enormous diplomatic player is, whatever one does, it's not going to disappear, right? I mean, and kind of its impact is reaching deep into our spaces, and COVID-19, I think, is an excellent example of how unforeseen, and in this situation, obviously deeply unfortunate, that impact is. But there's many, many other areas economically, and I think environmentally and geopolitically, where China reaches way beyond the boundaries of the country. And this is a very new phenomena, and at the moment becoming more and more intense. And I feel that political discourse, certainly in America and Europe, has not really started to kind of deal with the reality of this. The options that one had before of, kind of persisting with engagement because magically China would change to become like the world outside, when it was never very likely to become like the world outside. I mean, those are absolutely over. And the Xi Jinping leadership is a kind of pretty, kind of definitive rebuttal of that. But there's no sort of real strategic replacement of, what do we do now? I mean, we kind of run from China, but it's kind of now catching up with us, in all sorts of ways. Or do we just sort of try this issue of decoupling? So, I mean, just two things that I suppose for an introductory, kind of areas. Professor Takahara mentioned the economy. Now, the National People's Congress starts today, I believe, or has started today in Beijing, delayed from its normal time in March. The two things I suppose are really important about that. One is, of course, the economics, and that is particularly about unemployment. And that's going to be the same in America and Europe. Unemployment is going to be the big one. I'd be interested to hear comments about this, because unemployment in China has never really been an issue, and now it's an issue. And I think what we see in Europe is this real sense that jobs are going to be are being destroyed by the impact of COVID-19. And growth, of course, as has just been mentioned, that's going to be very, very important. And the narrative of the leadership in the National People's Congress about where growth will come from and what China is going to do on this new battleground, how they're going to restore their economy to positive growth, and whether they can do a better job than America or Europe, this is going to be really, really interesting. Because if they can do a better job, I mean, at the moment, no one knows, but if they can do a better job, that is a powerful, powerful statement about the viability of socialism with Chinese characteristics. I mean, in propaganda terms, but also actually then it's really hard to, kind of continue to be skeptical about this, the reality of this, approach to capitalism, because if it works in this area where everyone else is having terrible problems, well, then I think we have to be more humble, really, about, the kind of models that we're using. At the moment, of course, we don't know that, but I think that's going to be the battleground, not just an economic battleground. That is a profoundly ideological battleground. I suppose the second thing, of course, is what the leadership are going to say really about the narrative of COVID-19. Of course, at the beginning, it was regarded as a Chinese issue and a problem for Chinese governance. But I think, everyone now has shown that you can make mistakes with a problem like this. Kind of everyone has made mistakes. No one is in, kind of an incredible position here. Taiwan and South Korea and Japan possibly have been the victors because they've really shown, particularly Taiwan. I think Taiwan has got less than 10 fatalities from this. Extraordinary. So this is not just about democracy. A democracy has dealt with this issue. There is something deeper about how you have to have something to deal with a pandemic like this. And Taiwan obviously has got it, but the UK with more than 40,000 fatalities hasn't. So that's a sort of really, really interesting thing. The final thing I'll say is about the, kind of instability in China. I think, for sure, there's lots of anger in China about where this problem came from, the cover-up and issues like this. But we have to remember that the outside world for Chinese now, America and Europe, are pretty hostile places. I mean, not for Chinese people individually, although unfortunately that is happening. But I mean, China is now isolated, and the World Health Organization meeting this week has raised all these issues. There is a blame game. There's a lot of kind of issues about China speaking. This sort of dynamic of China, kind of really being isolated on many fronts means that I think even very disgruntled people in China may have lots of very, very valid issues with their government, for sure. But they will look at a world that is not hospitable to them as sort of, individuals and people. And I think that means that their sort of endurance or ability to be patient with their government is ironically going to probably increase because there doesn't seem to be any easy option for alternatives, and I think what is likely is that, and we're seeing it, the Chinese government will look at the resources of nationalism. Chinese people, on the whole, I think will probably become more nationalistic as a result of this because of the, kind of hostility of the world outside. It seems like every time President Trump, kind of tweets or does something about China, I think in China there are probably people thinking, "Wow, I mean, we are not popular. We're kind of, we might not kind of be super big fans of our government, but at least they're not, kind of going for us the way that others are." And so, I mean, I think nationalism, it's just going to be a part of our reality now. And as Bill knows very, very well, the modern world has never really understood Chinese nationalism. I think it's a very, very difficult phenomenon to put one's finger on. So I think those are sort of the broad areas that I'm interested in. I do have actually one final question, I suppose, to Professor Takahara, actually, in the discussion, and that is about decoupling. I mean, I think Japan is an example, I guess, quite a long time ago, 10 years ago, really, about how to decouple from China. And I wonder why more people aren't looking at how Japan did that. I mean, I do remember in the late 2000s when the South and East China Sea issue, particularly the East China Sea issue, was really intensifying again, that Japan, kind of basically removed some of its investment from China and did diversify. And I've always been very impressed by the fact that, Japan did but never said. It kind of, it just sort of got on with stuff and it never kind of, had big discussions. It just did things. And with decoupling, I think it's actually got a policy on China that seems to have created a balance. But maybe I'm wrong. So I'd be really fascinated to just sort of get corrections on that or sort of other ideas about that, because Japanese decoupling, I think, has things that may work because it seems to have not been politically hugely it's been a little bit politically problematic, but it does seem to have worked. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kerry. I very much like that sense of the diplomatic discomfort that China produces these days that you've identified, and I think I absolutely agree that it's rather sort of absurd and surreal to try to consider China as being a reality from which one can escape. The question is how to manage it. I think I'll go straight actually back to Akio, because you've asked a very interesting question of Akio about how the previous decoupling, which I think was around the time when rare earths exports were stopped, and there was that move away. How did that go, and how is it seen in Japan? And then I'll add to it a question that Duncan Bartlett, editor of Asian Affairs, has put in, which said, Kerry and I have both mentioned the political discussions in Britain about China in the Conservative Party. What's the mood in Japan, especially among members of the LDP? So that's a big pair of questions, but they're sort of related. Akio.
Well, the first question about decoupling between Japan and China, I don't think it really happened. When you look at the records of Japanese companies investing in China, yes, at times there were problems. The investments decreased, but all sorts of research has revealed that they were when the investments went down, it was not because of political reasons, but rather because of economic reasons. It could be some kind of a minor recession, in China. For example, in 2014, from 2014 to 2015, the Chinese economic situation was not very good. And also because of the rise in the wages in China, those have been the major reasons why there were some problems in the economic exchange between Japan and China in the past. And yes, but you're right in pointing out the China plus one thinking. That's always been in Japan for, let's say, the last 2 decades. And some companies who can do it, who can pursue that, have been doing it. But many companies find the Chinese market too profitable, too good. So they just don't pull out. And a lot of the big companies like Panasonic, last year they have decided on a very big investment, and also the car manufacturers. They are really into the Chinese market now. So, some industries or some enterprises who have had bad experiences, they will pull out. But other ones are going in. And overall, the investment is rising. That's the situation now. So when the Trump administration people or some others in the United States talk about decoupling, we kind of shiver. we don't want that. That's the basic situation. I mean, if there are companies that will pull out, and there are companies that will pull out, but that's not because of political reasons, but because of the economic reality that they are facing.
Before I let you go on to the next question, Akio, I just want to add on that. I mean, as you rightly are highlighting, decoupling is not really a binary choice. It's not about pulling out altogether or being there. Politically, a lot of the pressure about it is about dependency. In other words, about the leverage potentially over the Japanese economy or over another economy that the supply of a certain key component or ingredient like rare earths gives China. Has there been politically a serious drive since that incident in the late 2000s to decrease dependency, even if the overall integration of the economies may have increased? Has there been that?
I think that's that general point is valid, but when it comes to individual companies, some companies find the Chinese business too good to actually pursue that. They would rather put a lot of their eggs into the Chinese basket. They understand the danger of it, but that's the basic understanding that I have. Maybe there are a lot of business people watching this, and they can type in their comments criticizing my view, but that's the understanding that I have.
Okay. So how about the LDP? Is there
LDP, in the LDP, well, not only in the LDP, but in the political circles, in the Japanese society, we are also not monolithic. There are all sorts of views about China. And there are always those people who are critical about China, and especially nowadays because of the the COVID-19, people's unhappiness about the Chinese system, about the Chinese government. That's certainly the level has gone up, and there are politicians who would respond to that, but it hasn't really become a very conspicuous move, as it were. And I think it's because they understand that the current conservative government, the Abe administration, has the strategy to promote relationship with China. So it hasn't come to surface like it did in the past.
Kerry, can I turn to you? Thank you, Akio. Can I turn to you about, I mean, really combining a couple of questions that are about China's view of its global role, really, of its engagement and also its potential leadership role. One, Martin Hatfull, our deputy chair, has asked, since you rightly said about the increased nationalism with China, does that make it less likely that it will see an interest in taking a leadership role in other global and international institutions, or is that an expression of nationalism to some degree? To which one I would add to that a question that has also come in. We've seen like the sort of mask diplomacy and some PPE diplomacy that China has done during the health crisis, and you mentioned it. But do you think that, as it were, in the Chinese attitude and the nationalism and government national policy, there's likely to be, as it were, a further like initiative to seem to be taking the role that the United States might have taken after this crisis, or is that just not part of the Chinese agenda?
Yeah, I mean, so the idea of China sort of being a superpower, in the kind of wings, as it were. I certainly, think there are people in America who believe that, but I don't think there are many people in China who want that. In a sense, the kind of whole momentum of events over the last few years, particularly since Trump was elected, has sort of just accelerated China along a path that I think it, wanted to take several more years to do. I think he'd kind of thought, well, we'll be in a more dominant position because of our economy, maybe in the 2020s, late 2020s, maybe, and we'll have time to sort of, kind of deal with some of the issues that they're now dealing with now. One of which is to deal with a world that doesn't know a huge amount about China. I mean, I know there are many, many people probably listening in who know quite a lot about China, and, but our politicians on the whole, particularly in America and Britain, they never had to really think about China much. I mean, there's a few that really have, but not a huge number. And I think Chinese politicians probably are different. They have had to think about the outside world very, very, very much because of the way that they've had to integrate in many areas. So I think they've got a much, kind of more sort of cosmopolitan, which doesn't mean that they're cosmopolitan as people, but they do understand the way that the outside world figures in their life in ways which I don't think politicians in the West really kind of thought until COVID-19. I mean, they're sort of waking up and realizing, a lot of them, that there's this thing called China, and wow, it's kind of got this huge influence. And I think it's stirred them out of their complacency. The only problem is that they don't know which direction to sort of run in. So that's that's our problem. So I think China's sort of view of its global role is probably not the same as others' view of what it might think about its global role. I think it's opportunistic. It's certainly, been very active in multilateral fora. It's created its own sort of Chinese version of multilateral fora, like the Belt and Road, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, these sorts of things. But they've been contested quite a lot. And I think COVID-19 basically will mean that those who before COVID-19 felt that China had a important role, Pakistan and countries like that, the believers, well, they'll carry on believing. The skeptics, India, for instance, most importantly, but of course in the neighborhood, but of course China, America, are going to be much more opposed. This is much more confrontational situation. And so that kind of comes to the issue of the mass, the mass diplomacy. I mean, it's been symptomatic, really, of this massive mismatch. China, I think, has wanted mostly to be altruistic and felt it was helping. But of course, the way in which this has been done in Italy and places like that has been problematic, because there's a sort of way in which it's been angled to a domestic audience in China, and in the way that it's received in the kind of countries in which it's been undertaken, and it proves a total mismatch between these two audiences. One sort of uncomfortable, I suppose, kind of getting aid from a country that in very recent times was a recipient of aid, but also not really liking to figure as kind of almost like charities. And of course, China feeling fairly irritated when its largesse is not, kind of recognized. So I think this is just a sort of initial example of where we're heading, where, on the one hand, you've got the Chinese imperatives of messaging, mostly for the domestic audience, which is, of course, extremely important. On the other, you've got a world outside that, for all sorts of reasons, sees a totally different message from the same act.
And let's, following on from that, I mean, let me ask you both about the Belt and Road Initiative. As you rightly say, Kerry, it's been a very important part of China's outreach, if you like. It's been widely criticized or treated with some suspicion in many sorts of countries as being designed to set up dependency or to increase kind of a new colonialism, if you like. Well, here's the big test. A lot of these recipient countries of debt, of at least loans, are now going to be having difficulty in repaying them. How do you think that China will manage the Belt and Road Initiative, let's say in the next 5 years in the post-pandemic period? Kerry, start with you, and then I'll go to Tokyo.
I'm thinking of Marx, Groucho Marx, and he's, what is it? A friend in need is a real nuisance. And sort of, I mean, so this is an interpretation issue. With Sri Lanka and other places, a lot of the commentary has been on debt diplomacy and, kind of creating these sort of obligations. And I really wonder whether China wants that. I mean, it sort of is, in some sense, I think, resistant to having responsibility. It has a view of itself which is still, kind of a bit of a victim, still, like a kind of, sort of vulnerable kind of place that needs help. And it's just a bizarre situation that we're now, kind of having China, as I say, coming to save or damn us. So, and I think China finds this very, very strange. So I think this debt diplomacy is a real double-edged sword. I mean, for sure, China will have all sorts of opportunities to use, if it deals with its economic problems, which are significant in the next sort of few months and years, if it kind of succeeds in getting out of the current problems, it will have enormous leverage, right? I mean, no one denies that, but I think it's really going to be a mixed blessing for it, because a lot of these territories it has no real knowledge of. I think someone mentioned Africa before. China's, had a huge amount of interest in Africa for the last decade, but what we've seen in the last few weeks has been pretty kind of catastrophic in a way for China's image in Africa, with the treatment of, African people in some parts of China. So I think it's showing that, I don't think China really wants to be in this position. It will not walk away from opportunities, but I don't think it's having a comfortable time. And I don't think it's got this narrative of dominance and, kind of controlling things, except about things it cares about. I don't think it wants to be the new US. But the problem is a lot of people in the United States, including its current president, seem to think that's what it wants. And that's its own different problem.
Well, and Britain was famously described as having built an empire in a fit of absence of mind. These things can suddenly overwhelm you. Akio, how does it look from Tokyo as far as this debt diplomacy and Belt and Road Initiative looks?
Well, I also think that it's not a good idea to overestimate the Belt and Road Initiative. I don't think China is going to conquer the world by that. I tend to compare it with a constellation in the sky. No one has ever seen a constellation. It's only an image. It's only in your head. But it's important for Xi Jinping, because my definition of it is that the Belt and Road Initiative is the symbol of Xi Jinping's authority and power. So he very much would like to promote it, but the Chinese people, who cares? They are very pragmatic. So if the project is profitable and if it makes money, then they are for it. But many of the projects don't make money. So I think with the COVID-19 and with the Chinese economic downturn, even Xi Jinping will not be able to gather enough money, enough funds to implement the many projects that the Chinese side has promised. And this would bring about disappointment, more disappointment to the developing nations, that's for sure. But from the developing countries' point of view, there are no alternatives. And therefore, as long as some money is coming, then of course they will keep on asking the Chinese, please come and investment in Sri Lanka, for instance. So when I talk to the Sri Lankans about Hambantota, about the debt trap and so on and so forth, the response is quite a natural one. So what? If there are people who would come and invest, what's wrong about that? It's better than no money coming in. So I suppose because of the global problem that we are all facing now, not only the Belt and Road Initiative projects, but also other projects from other donors won't be implemented. So this is going to be a very difficult situation for the developing world.
And thank you. I can follow up with a question for you, Akio, because Michael McClay, who's a consultant to many companies around the world, including Japanese ones, has asked this following question. Professor Takahara mentions the non-nationalist moderates in China who aim to maintain good international links. It might be invidious to name such people, but in which part of the state and party machinery would he locate such people? They will presumably not be evident at the NPC, but how will they be making their influence felt? How much moderate feeling is there, for example, within the PLA? Where are these moderates?
Right, very good question. One interesting and important example is in the dealing with the US over a lot of issues that we are all familiar about. You remember that until April last year, they were going to sign a 150-page agreement in which there were many, many concessions that were to be made by the Chinese side. I would think that Vice Premier Liu He and the team that he leads, they are the reformers. They are willing to use this American Gaiatsu to reform the economy, just like the former Prime Minister Zhu Rongji used the entering of the WTO to promote the reforms of the economic system in China. And in academia, of course, there are quite a lot of people. But I would say not only that, even in the PLA, I can't name them, but so I would say they are not the majority. They are the minority side group. The number is not as big as the other side, partly because of Xi Jinping. But those people are certainly there, even inside the system. So we have to get together and try to promote changes in China.
Kerry, I mean, following on from that, there's a question, not surprisingly, about Taiwan from Andrew Fraser of Mitsubishi Corporation. One could say, before the pandemic, it was possible to put together a narrative saying that Xi Jinping had a pretty bad 2019 with things going pretty awry in Hong Kong, and then the re-election of the president, the anti-China president of Taiwan. How does Taiwan look to you right now, and how does it fit into like the nationalist mood that you've described?
Well, I mean, I don't think Xi Jinping did have a sort of too bad 2019. I mean, I think Hong Kong, in the eyes of Beijing, this isn't my opinion, but in the eyes of Beijing, Hong Kong has sort of voted with its feet to sort of become irrelevant, in some ways, politically at least, to China. I mean, it's managed to assert itself and kind of created a great deal of division. And I think we overestimate I believe we overestimate how important China thinks the issue of Hong Kong is. I mean, it preserves what it needs to preserve there, but I think it kind of doesn't really sort of take a great deal of notice of kind of the protests beyond the sort of anger at how much instability they've caused. So I think it's got a pretty brutally pragmatic, realist view. But there are consequences. I mean, because of course, one country, two systems framework in Hong Kong I think it's stopped. I mean, I think that stopped about 5 or 6 years ago. There is no one country, two systems. There's one country. Okay, right. And, that's the sort of absolute dominant priority. And so I think in Taiwan, you'd look at this model and you say, this is not remotely going to offer any kind of assurances. It was originally, in the 1980s under Deng Xiaoping, actually one country, two systems was sort of promoted or thought up to deal with Taiwan. But I mean, I don't meet many Taiwanese now who think that this is remotely applicable to them. So I'm sure there must be some sort of ancient Chinese sort of kind of story about the more powerful you are further from home, that the less the thing you most want, it becomes within reach. It's clear that for China, the thing that it's absolutely wants is reunification with Taiwan. But I think that gets more remote by the day, because basically the kind of Taiwanese kind of identity is so strong now. And Tsai Ing-wen's very, very successful re-election in January and her inauguration this week just shows that she is a very popular leader, despite having been quite unpopular before things in Hong Kong kicked off. But I think she can thank the situation in Hong Kong for getting her a tremendous kind of re-election. I think 58% of the votes, and much higher than her first sort of term. So I think that with Taiwan is a massive quandary for China. It's gets more and more out of reach in a weird way. The stronger China gets, the more it sort of gets away, because you're really kind of thinking about is in Beijing's eyes, a province of 23 million people who just do not remotely, day by day, think that they are Chinese. They think they're Taiwanese. And, that's the thing. You can't really, I mean, in Hong Kong, it's a big enough issue with, Hong Kongese identity, which is, I think, much more problematic. Hong Kong identity is not an easy thing to articulate. With Taiwanese identity, it's pretty strong, right? I mean, it's pretty strong culturally and politically. Well, I mean, that's the only kind of way you're going to be able to handle that is by enforcement. But the consequences of that will be absolutely colossal. So while we see this rhetoric at the moment of hardness by China and Beijing towards Taiwan, I think in practice, this is not at the moment any more soluble than it was, less soluble than it was a year ago and 2 years ago, less soluble.
Thank you. And Akio, well, both of them, but I'll start with Akio. John Nash has asked about the accusations that the World Health Organization was unduly influenced by China, and indeed the question of where investigations and so forth, which China is now, were in principle at least signed on to. How is that seen in Japan, Akio, and how far do you think this will stay a part of the agenda in coming months and years, or is this a sort of momentary piece of noise that we'll forget about in 6 months or 12 months' time?
Well, the question of Taiwan and the WHO is going to stay, and it's going to remain a very important issue, especially perhaps in this part of the region, because Taiwan is our neighbor, and our neighbor is not included in the World Health system. It's not a good situation for us. Of course, not for the 23 million people in Taiwan. So I think this question is going to return every year. And yes, I think there was a question about Chinese influence on the WHO.
Yes.
And one good example was Dr. Tedros mentioning in one press conference about the criticisms, the racist something that he's receiving from Taiwan, and which was rather shocking, because I think very few people actually believe that if any of those criticisms were actually made, they will come from Taiwan. So the naivete behind that remark made a lot of people worry about the situation, I think.
And do you think that the issue of the question of whether the virus emerged carelessly or otherwise from the virology lab in Wuhan, is that going to be an important question, or is it again just a piece of Trumpian politics?
Well, I think for the sake of the welfare, the health and welfare of the people worldwide, we should find out what the origin was. So in that sense, it was good that the WHO decided to do a thorough research about that. And China, of course, first was opposing that, but finding out that many other countries were for this project, they had to say yes, which was quite good, I think.
And Kerry, I would, as obviously a non-China scholar, but just a general cynic of human behavior, I would imagine many Chinese critics of their own government would assume that incompetence at the lab in Wuhan was quite a plausible explanation. Does that have any resonance in Chinese domestic discussion and politics, or is that just, as it were, there together with a feeling that the school wasn't rebuilt properly before the earthquake, or the train, the railway lines, an accident was caused because of, again, incompetence, but we all think that governments are incompetent?
Well, I mean, I guess they may have in January, and then they saw the rest of the world and how we responded. And I think, people are more sanguine now. I mean, I think that's one, if this had only been principally an Asian or a Chinese issue, I mean, I think it, kind of would have been, there would have been a lot of anger about how it's been dealt with. And for sure, Europe and America could have gone on saying, this proves that governance in China is not, kind of working and not fit for purpose. But having seen the way in which it's been dealt with in the UK and in America, in Brazil, I think it's been a great leveler. Incompetence is beyond having any boundaries and any culture. Their incompetence is very, very common. And so I think that's made it a little bit more difficult. So for Chinese people, I think I have been struck by the fact that, for sure, they are not super happy with how, the way this issue was dealt with, many of them. But I think that they are pretty angry at the way in which, the blaming has happened, particularly in America. Trump's tweets have been inflammatory in some ways. And Pompeo, he's seems every time he opens his mouth, he just sort of, kind of creates a lot of anger, not just by the Chinese government. I think, many Chinese people. We have to remember, that in any country, for sure, you feel like you have the right to be furious at your government, but you're not super great when some outsider comes marching along and says, how your country is no good and your government's no good. I think it's been a sort of remarkable kind of understanding of basic human psychology. I mean, I think, America and Europe, the world has really valid questions to ask China. Hopefully through the investigation of the WHO, those questions will be asked. And it's in China's interest, for sure, to make sure there are answers, because it doesn't want this problem to come back, right? I mean, let's remember that many people in China died and suffered from this disease too. So if it was a conspiracy, it doesn't seem to have been a conspiracy that China, came out the winner of it. It's suffered too. But I mean, I can't see the point in having, a kind of very emotional, blaming sort of, frenzy, because this pandemic clearly doesn't care what emotional state people are in when it comes for them. It just is a, disease, right? And it's not a disease with a passport.
What do both of you think that where future of cooperation with China is going to look like? If you were still a diplomat, Kerry, or you were studying diplomacy, Akio, if one thinks that obviously strength of opinion about China is a bipartisan issue in the US, as you've said, it's spread in the UK and in Europe. Nevertheless, we can think beyond Donald Trump. He's not he's not the writer of Sato's diplomatic practice for the future. So what would
I mean,
how would
I don't want to. I mean, I don't want to. So I think I better let Professor Takahara have a final word on this, because I don't want to leave people too depressed. But if I could say something initially, I mean, in the UK, I guess I've always been puzzled by what British people thought of China. You know, it's always been difficult. In Australia, when I was based there, and when I travelled around the world, I think you get a sense that people are intrigued. Maybe they're anti. You know, they're kind of troubled by China. There's usually an emotion, and British people have always been, you know, sort of more wound up by things in Europe or kind of local issues. And China's always been quite remote, despite the history. It's been, you know, the history of Hong Kong and all these sort of links. It's very, you know, kind of almost like an elite thing. I mean, for wider society, not a big interest in China. And so this whole issue has brought to the surface a kind of emotion about China. And I think the problem is that, you know, with political leadership, that emotion can kind of be driven in certain directions. But the two things I've learned in the last 3 months, which I should have learned many years before, is firstly, Britain never had a policy towards China. Never had a policy towards China. You know, and now it's sort of saying we should have a policy towards China when your levers are so limited. You know, so I think that's been really, really striking. The second, I guess, is that now British people have sort of asked themselves what they think about China. The answer is not the right one. I mean, they really, I mean, I think a survey, probably not a very robust survey, but it said something like more than 80% of British people are negative about China, which is higher than almost anywhere else. I'm sure if you had that survey in Japan, it would be a bit more nuanced. We do not want nuance on China. We have decided we're just going to dislike it. And I think this is, you know, if you're going to make that decision, it's 30 years too late, right? I mean, it's 30 years too late. And I suppose the final thing is I'm deeply amused by, you know, this kind of idea that Britain, you know, sort of liberated from Europe, is going to go marching towards China and tell it, you know, don't do this, don't do that. I mean, again, this isn't 30 years too late. This is like 60, 70 years too late. I mean, it seems to me we are going to go through a painful process of coming up with a policy. And if the politicians don't say to the public what is the direction, the public will drive them into a direction which will either be, you know, completely futile or actually really unpleasant. And I think that's going to be that will be a disaster.
Akio, how do you see it?
There's been public surveys conducted every year about Japan-China relations, about China. And all the years, there's one question, that is, do you have a good image or bad image about China? And almost every the results about the same. That is, 90% or so of the Japanese people do not have a good image of China because of the boats that they send to the Senkaku Islands. You know, now since 1971, the Chinese also claim sovereignty over these islands, and in the past 10 years or so, they have started to send their patrol boats into the territorial waters and the contiguous zones around it. So that's the emotional side of things. But if in the same survey, they also ask, do you think Japan-China relations are important? And almost every year, actually every year, the result is about the same. That is 70% of the Japanese people answer that Japan-China relations are important. And the politicians understand this twist, you know, by reason, the Japanese people understand the importance of China. So this is the contradictory situation that we have to face, and we have to live with, and we have to coexist and prosper together. And that's the basic understanding. Emotionally, there are many things that we would like to say to China, but we have to find a way to cooperate, because there are real issues that we need to cooperate with China about. Coronavirus. How are you going to solve this, to tackle this? We need cooperation with the Chinese side, and you know, many non-traditional security issues, anti-piracy, drug trafficking, you name it, environmental degradation. You are lucky you're far away, but we are next to China. So a lot of issues over which we have to cooperate with China, and I think the Japanese people understand that. So it's not going to be easy. China's national power is going to rise, maybe not as quickly as before, but it will keep on rising. So how can we try to guide China? We cannot shape China. Only the Chinese people can shape China, I think. But we can try and shape the Chinese people. We can try and share values. We can try and exchange our emotions, exchange our knowledge. And we don't understand China. They understand us even less. How can we coexist in such kind of a situation? So there are a lot of work that we have to do.
You do, and I hope from the sake of the Japanese economy that you welcome back Chinese tourists quite quickly. Do you think that will happen quickly, Akio?
Not too soon because of the virus situation, but now many Japanese are craving for that day. Come soon, come back.
Right. Well, we've reached the end of our hour, and I want to thank both Professor Akio Takahara and Professor Kerry Brown for a marvelous discussion about one of the world's, today's world's most central and most important subjects of China. And thank you, Japan Society members and supporters, for all of your excellent questions. I'm sorry if I haven't been able to answer all of them, but most of them I think have been touched upon by some of the other answers that we've received, which have been very clear and candid. And thank you very much to you both. Next week, we're going to welcome just one speaker, Linda Grattan, professor at London Business School, because she is a specialist both in Britain and in Japan on the future of work and on what she calls the 100-year life. And so I'm going to have a one-to-one conversation with Linda Grattan about whether the new working practices that we've all encompassed and embraced during the pandemic are going to have an enduring effect, and how to make the best of them, both for Japanese companies and British companies. Meanwhile, let me again thank Kerry Brown and Akio Takahara for sparing time and for illuminating us so splendidly. Thank you to both of you.
Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank
you.
you.
Goodbye. Thank you.